Elijah Brooks was the only black student in Oxford's most elite math class, invisible until the day he solved the unsolvable. The professor called it impossible for someone like him. Elijah did it in 5 minutes. Instead of applause, the school accused him of cheating. By nightfall, his ID was revoked, and his dorm was locked. But what no one knew was who his grandfather really was, and why Oxford had spent decades trying to erase his name. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning air in Oxford, Mississippi, carried a strange kind of coldness, the sort that clung to the edges of brick pathways and settled between the grand oaks lining the university courtyard. Students hurried across campus, shivering inside their freshly ironed coats, gripping coffee cups like lifelines, as they rushed toward Professor Halbrook's advanced theoretical math class. Even for Oxford, known for pushing its students to the brink of intellectual exhaustion, there was a particular unease circling the hallways today. Word had spread long before the first bell rang that Halbrook had prepared something special, an unbeatable bonus problem, one that supposedly wasn't meant to be solved. Inside the classroom, the tension thickened as soon as students stepped through the door. They paused, staring at the monstrous equations sprawled across the chalkboard, its symbols twisting and spiraling into a pattern that almost seemed to mock them. The chalk marks looked fresh, carved with an aggression that felt intentional, as though the professor had enjoyed the performance of writing it. At the back of the room, Elijah Brooks slipped into his usual seat, quiet, unnoticed, unbothered on the surface, even as he sensed the unspoken boundaries that wrapped tightly around him. At 17, he was younger than most of the students here. A fresh transfer from Detroit, he carried a backpack that had seen too many bus rides, shoes slightly worn at the edges, and a kind of self-contained alertness that didn't belong to most teenagers his age. To some of the white students who glanced at him with the wary curiosity of someone examining something out of place, he looked like a misprint in the glossy catalog of Oxford's expectations. Elijah never responded to the looks. He'd learned long ago that silence could be armor, especially in places where people believed he should prove himself before even speaking. Instead, he studied the board from behind half-lowered lashes, absorbing the shape of the question, the hidden rhythm inside it. Numbers didn't judge, equations didn't smirk, patterns didn't whisper. They simply existed, waiting for someone to see them clearly. Around him, the students whispered in tones that pretended to be subtle. "Looks impossible," muttered a girl in the row ahead of him. "Halbrook's being dramatic again," another whispered. "Elijah probably doesn't even know what half that means." He heard them, but the comments barely grazed him. He knew what they expected, that a black transfer student from a public school in Detroit had no business in a top-tier math class at a southern university with an elite reputation and a painfully selective facade of diversity. Elijah never argued with their assumptions. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. And yet here, even brilliance came attached with suspicion. The door swung open. Professor Halbrook stepped inside with the briskness of a man who enjoyed watching students crumble. Tall, rigid, with hair the color of old chalk, and a stern face sharpened by years of superiority. He walked with a confidence that came from never having been questioned, not by students, not by colleagues, not by anyone who didn't fit his definition of who belonged here. He set his leather briefcase on the desk, adjusted his glasses, and turned slowly toward the room, savoring the anticipation like a performer preparing to begin his show. "Good morning," he said, though his tone carried none of the warmth typically associated with the words. "I see you've noticed the board." Students shifted in their seats. Some forced polite smiles. Others held their breath. Halbrook clasped his hands behind his back. "This," he began, nodding at the equation, "is the bonus problem for today. As some of you may have heard, no one has managed to solve it correctly in the last 17 years of my teaching. Not here. Not at Yale during my guest lectures. Not even at Princeton." Brandon Kellerman, a tall, blonde student, whose confidence often bordered on entitlement, leaned to his friend and whispered loudly, "So basically, we're wasting our time." The professor smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Mr. Kellerman, I find it important to occasionally remind students of their limits." A few students chuckled. Elijah didn't. Halbrook continued, "This is not a problem for the average mind. In fact, I doubt very much anyone in this room has the mathematical maturity to approach it correctly." The sentence hung in the room like a gauntlet thrown directly at their feet. Halbrook paced slowly, but he said lightly, "You are welcome to attempt it." After all, ambition is admirable, even when misplaced. A subtle wave of discomfort spread across the room. The professor wasn't just challenging them, he was belittling them, and for reasons Elijah understood too well. The comments seemed directed at him more than anyone else. Elijah recognized the pattern. Halbrook had looked at him twice since entering the room. Not long enough to acknowledge him as a student, but just enough to signal something colder. Elijah wasn't new to this particular brand of academic hostility. He'd lived through teachers who taught entire lessons without meeting his eyes, counselors who suggested easier classes, classmates who assumed he cheated when he got perfect scores. Excellence, in his hands, was often treated as arrogance. But Elijah did not misread difficulty as impossibility. He stared at the board again. Slowly, he tilted his head, following the curve of the problem. A subtle realization flickered in his mind. Something familiar in the structure. Something elegant beneath the chaos. Meanwhile, the murmurs grew. "This is ridiculous," a girl whispered. "Why does he even bother?" Another asked. Brandon looked smug. "He's flexing. That's all." And yet, Elijah barely heard any of them. For a moment, the world narrowed to chalk lines and quiet logic. Halbrook tapped the board. "I'll give extra credit to anyone who attempts a solution. But let me be clear, failure is expected." He said it with a hint of amusement, as if he enjoyed predicting their defeat. Elijah exhaled slowly. He didn't normally draw attention to himself. The back row was his sanctuary, a place where he could observe without participating. But something about the professor's tone, sharp, dismissive, laced with the acidic certainty that no black student had ever or would ever outthink him, stirred something inside Elijah that he didn't often let surface. Determination. Quiet, heavy, unmoving, like the moment before a storm shifts the air. He opened his notebook. His pencil hovered, his pulse steady. "Up front," Brandon scoffed. "This is the kind of math only people who've had insane prep schools can even attempt." A friend nudged him. "Definitely not the kind you learn in Detroit." That one stung. Not because it was true, but because of how confidently ignorant it was. Elijah felt the words like pebbles thrown toward his back. They didn't hurt him, but they chipped at something. Not pride, not self-worth, but patience. Professor Halbrook walked toward the windows, hands clasped. "Well," he said, voice smooth with condescension, "is anyone brave enough to try?" No one moved. The silence felt orchestrated, a performance designed to reinforce the hierarchy Halbrook cherished. Then Elijah did something unexpected, even to himself. He raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It simply rose, steady and deliberate, cutting through the stagnant quiet of the room. A few students gasped. Brandon turned fully in his seat, eyebrows lifting. "You've got to be kidding," he muttered. Halbrook stopped walking. He slowly turned his head, eyes narrowing, as if trying to decide whether Elijah was being bold or foolish. "Perhaps both." "Yes?" the professor asked. Elijah's voice came out firm, calm, edged with something unshakable. "I believe I can solve it." The room froze. A pin drop would have echoed. Even the fluorescent light seemed to flicker in surprise. Halbrook's smirk returned, but this time it twitched, unsettled. "Do you?" he said quietly. Now, all eyes fixed forward, except Elijah's. His gaze burned into the question on the board, seeing not challenge, but invitation. The professor smirks and says, "No one in this room has the mind for this. Prove me wrong." All eyes shift forward, except Elijah's. His gaze burns into the question. The chalkboard seemed to vibrate with defiance. The equation sprawled across it wasn't just advanced, it was engineered to intimidate. Tangled with obscure notations and nested functions, it resembled a locked gate rather than an academic exercise. Students didn't approach it like a challenge, they approached it like a threat. Professor Halbrook knew exactly what he had placed there. This was no ordinary bonus question. It was a filter, a public sieve to separate who belonged in the room and who didn't. And Elijah Brooks? According to that unspoken metric, he wasn't supposed to be here. The tension from the previous moment hung thick in the air, suspended like static after lightning. Elijah's hand, still raised, cut through the collective paralysis of the room. A moment earlier, he had been invisible. Now he was center stage. Professor Halbrook turned slowly, adjusting his glasses, his smirk now frozen somewhere between amusement and discomfort. It was the first time he had truly looked at Elijah since the semester began. "I believe I can solve it," Elijah repeated. this time standing. Students turned in their seats to face him. Some smirked, some frowned, others whispered under their breath. Brandon Kellerman, who occupied the third row like it belonged to him, leaned back with a cocky chuckle. From Detroit? The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They landed like stones dropped into silence. A few nearby students snorted. Others looked away. The implication hung heavy. The idea that someone from the Detroit public system could touch something built by academic elites was laughable. Elijah didn't blink. He didn't shift his weight. He'd heard worse in quieter rooms, in darker places. What these students called subtle, he called scripted. Helbrook gestured lazily. The floor is yours, Mr. Brooks. Don't let us down. Elijah walked toward the board. His steps were calm, his face unreadable. In his hand was a battered spiral notebook with a cover so faded it was almost blank. The desk he passed had better bags draped across it, sleeker laptops, newer textbooks. But none of that mattered when you understood the language of logic deeper than the fear of judgment. He picked up a fresh piece of chalk, white against his darker skin, and stared at the equation for just a moment before his hand moved. Behind him, the murmurs resumed. Not loud, just sharp enough. Does he even know what that symbol means? He's just guessing. Brandon leaned in to a friend. He's going to embarrass himself. I almost feel bad. But then Elijah did something that stilled the whispers. He erased a portion of the problem. Gasps fluttered across the room. A few students exchanged glances. Brandon straightened in his seat, his smirk faltering. What's he doing? Someone hissed. Elijah's voice was quiet, clear and strangely confident. This part is a decoy. It's a misdirection technique, used to mask the convergence behavior. Whoever designed it didn't want you to notice the recursion pattern underneath. Even Halbrook blinked. The professor opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Elijah kept going, drawing new lines, shifting symbols, reconstructing the equation, as if he were tuning an instrument. The chalk moved fluidly under his fingers, forming bridges between concepts that only a handful in the room could even follow. And those who could follow began to feel something they hadn't expected. Respect laced with unease. Brandon's hand slowly fell away from his face. Wait, he muttered. In his notebook, Elijah had already worked through this type of problem before, though in isolation, far from academic fame or ivory-covered lecture halls. He had seen versions of it in his own late-night sessions at the Detroit Library. He had found similar challenges buried in abandoned problem books, the ones most kids skipped because they looked too dense. But Elijah had never been like most kids. He'd never had the luxury to be average. And now, as the final symbols came together, as the chalk reached the end of the board, Elijah paused, not because he doubted, but because this moment of silence was something he'd earned. He circled his answer. A single, unmistakable result. He set the chalk down, turned around, and looked Professor Halbrook directly in the eye. The professor's mouth was drawn into a tight line. His eyes scanned the board, fingers fidgeting at his cuff. Is that correct? One student whispered. Halbrook didn't answer. Not immediately. Elijah spoke first. It's not just correct. It's the only path to the solution. Every other attempt is a loop that never converges. The silence was volcanic. It pulsed with the threat of eruption. No one clapped. No one said a word. Brandon stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. He probably copied it. That equation's been online before, hasn't it? A few students nodded automatically, hoping to reset the balance, to remind the room that even now, even after this, Elijah was still other. But then a twist. Professor Halbrook stepped forward. Not toward Elijah, toward the board. He studied the solution. He didn't speak. Not at first. But then he did something that surprised everyone. He erased it. Just like that. He turned back to the class. Class dismissed, he said flatly. Elijah stood motionless, his eyes narrowing. The professor hadn't acknowledged the correctness, hadn't refuted it either. He had simply wiped it from existence. Students gathered their things, confused. No one looked Elijah in the eye. As the last student filed out, Elijah remained. He looked at the erased board, his hands still chalk-stained. Professor Halbrook walked past him. We'll discuss this further. Don't assume one moment means you belong. Elijah said nothing, but his silence wasn't surrender. It was planning. Elijah raises his hand. The room falls silent. The professor's smirk freezes. I believe I can solve it. For a moment after Professor Halbrook erased the board, time refused to move. The air in the room had shifted, no longer taut with anticipation, but dense with denial. Elijah stood at the front of the room with chalk dust clinging to his fingertips and a growing silence wrapping around him like a shroud. He should have felt pride, relief, triumph, but what settled in his chest instead was something far more familiar, that sharp, bone-deep ache of being erased in real time. He turned and walked back to his seat. It felt longer now, that walk, as though each step forced him through an invisible fog of tension. He passed by Brandon Kellerman, who gave him a sarcastic nod, and said under his breath, "Guess plagiarism's easier when nobody expects you to know the answer." The words barely grazed him. They weren't new, they weren't even original, they were just louder now. As Elijah sat down, he noticed the TA, Marissa Lowe, was still at the front of the class, phone in hand, subtly angling it to capture the board before the last bits of chalk residue faded. Her eyes briefly met his. Something passed between them. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. She'd seen what he did. She knew. The other students began to shuffle out, conversations low and murmured, like an uneasy church congregation, after a sermon that hit too hard. Was that even real math? Someone muttered. Maybe it's some old solution he found online. Another replied. People post everything these days. He didn't even look nervous. That's suspicious in itself. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows. Elijah remained behind, slowly packing his notebook. It still held the original work, scratched out pages, margin notes, pattern tests, proof. But in rooms like this, proof was rarely enough. He walked alone across the quad, unnoticed by the professors he passed, unseen by the clusters of white students gathered in laughter. For all the noise he had made in that classroom, outside of it he was already fading again. That's how this place worked. Recognition wasn't given, it was rationed, and never without cost. Hours later, in the library's corner nook, his unofficial sanctuary, Elijah opened his laptop to revise a separate problem set. The university portal glitched briefly when he logged in. The first flicker of something off, but he brushed it off, too focused on the calm logic of numbers to care. Then came the message.
Error. Access denied.
Contact university IT support. He blinked. Tried again. Same message. He opened his student email in a separate tab, and for a brief second, it loaded only to immediately boot him out. When he refreshed the page, the new message appeared. Your account has been temporarily disabled due to an academic integrity review. Please await further communication. His heartbeat doubled. For a moment, he thought it was a glitch. Then his phone buzzed. One text from an unknown number. You should have kept your head down. He stared at the screen, the words burning through the glow. No name, no context, just threat wrapped in implication. Back in his dorm, he tried accessing his student portal again. Same denial. His digital existence, grades, class notes, assignments, communications was suddenly under lock and key. In the span of a few hours, he'd gone from anomaly to suspect. Down the hallway, voices echoed from someone's room. Laughter, music, the rhythm of students untouchable by consequence. Elijah sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the blank screen, then at the stack of papers on his desk. His original notes, timed calculations, the raw process. It didn't matter. He knew how this would play out. This wasn't about the math. It never was. Later that night, Brandon's voice could be heard down the hall, bragging loudly over a game of pool. I mean, come on. We all know that problem's been floating around forums for years. I'm just saying, makes you wonder. Nobody questioned him. No one ever did. Elijah sat alone, laptop closed, notebook clenched in his lap. He flipped to the page where the final version of his solution still sat in ink. Perfect, flawless, undeniable, but also invisible. He thought about his mother back in Detroit, who'd told him over and over, "You'll have to be twice as good to get half the credit, baby." He hadn't believed her when he was younger. He wanted to think that brilliance could speak for itself, that excellence had no color. But this wasn't math class anymore. This was something else. The silence from Halbrook, the erasure of the board, the refusal to even say correct. Those were answers louder than any grade or comment. And now, this. The sudden shutdown of his account. The vague warning, the absence of any official explanation. He looked back at the chalk-stained cuffs of his sweater, and remembered how still the room had become when he circled that final number. Not in awe, not in celebration, in fear, because he had broken a rule none of them had written down. But all of them understood. Brilliance from someone like him wasn't supposed to exist. And if it did, it had to be explained away, discredited, or buried. The knock on his door startled him. He opened it to find Marissa, the TA, standing in the hallway, her coat pulled tight against the night chill. "I just wanted you to know," she said, her voice hushed. "I took pictures of the board," before he erased it. Elijah didn't respond, just nodded. "I don't know what they're going to try," she added. "But if they come after you, I'll speak up." It was the first act of solidarity he'd felt since arriving. But even that felt fragile. After she left, he sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in that moment, the reality settled fully into his bones. The institution wasn't just indifferent. It was hostile. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. And he had just become a target. Later that night, Elijah's student email is disabled. A message appears. "Your academic integrity is under review." The summons arrived just after sunrise, slid under Elijah's dorm door, in an unmarked envelope. The paper inside was coldly formal, an invitation to appear before the Academic Standards Committee for an urgent integrity matter. No details, no context, just a date, a time, and the heavy implication that something was already decided. Elijah sat at the edge of his bed for a long time, staring at the letter. The silence around him was louder now, like even the walls knew what this meant. Outside his window, campus moved on as if nothing had happened. Students jogged past, bikes rolled by, laughter drifted from somewhere down the corridor. But for him, time had narrowed. He arrived early at the administration building, wearing the only blazer he owned, the one his mother had sent him with a note. "For when they make you prove you belong." The lobby was sterile. Polished floors, oil paintings of long-dead white men, and the faint smell of expensive carpet cleaner. When the committee called him in, the room was colder than the hallway. A long wooden table stretched across the center, with 5 faculty members seated behind it. Only one of them, Professor Dean from the Humanities Department, made eye contact as Elijah entered. The others kept their faces arranged in blank neutrality, like judges who already knew the verdict. No one asked him to sit. But he did. A tall woman with silver hair and stiff posture spoke first. "Mr. Brooks, we've received a serious accusation of academic misconduct concerning your actions in Professor Halbrook's class." Elijah's hands rested on his lap, calm but tense. "What exactly am I being accused of?" The woman did not answer directly. She flipped through a folder and said, "We received an anonymous report suggesting your solution to the bonus problem was not original, that it was taken from an obscure graduate forum, password protected of course, known only to advanced research students." Elijah blinked. "That's not possible. I solved the problem myself. I can walk you through every step of my process." "That won't be necessary," interrupted another member, a stout man with a trimmed white beard. "This isn't a math evaluation, Mr. Brooks. It's a matter of ethics." Something shifted inside Elijah then. The realization landed slowly, not like a blow but like a verdict read aloud after hours of hope. They weren't here to examine his logic. They were here to erase it. No evidence was shown. No questions were asked about how he derived his answer. No one asked for the original notes in his notebook, which he had brought. Instead, the silver-haired chairwoman closed the folder and leaned back. "We'll be reviewing the matter and reaching a decision in the coming days. Until then, your student privileges, including digital access, will remain suspended." Elijah stood, swallowing the frustration clawing at his throat. "I have proof I did the work. I can show you." Her voice was clipped. "You may submit any documents through the official channel. This meeting is adjourned." He left the room colder than when he entered. Outside the administration building, the air was sharp, biting through his jacket. As he walked across campus, white students passed by, some laughing, others whispering. He caught a few of their words. "Is that him?" "Yeah, the one who cheated." Knew it was too good to be true. Elijah kept walking. He had learned long ago that stopping to defend yourself in a world that's already judged you is like yelling into thunder. His feet eventually took him to the science building. Familiar quiet, a sanctuary of sorts. But even there, the air felt different. Professors he passed gave him nods that were too brief, or avoided him altogether. He wasn't just the student who solved the impossible. He was now the student whose name triggered warnings in email threads. He sat in an empty lab classroom, resting his hands on the cold steel table. He remembered being 10 years old in Detroit, hiding his worksheets under comic books because other kids had mocked him for acting white when he finished early. He remembered the librarian who secretly let him stay after hours to study, whispering, "Don't let them make you small." And now, even at Oxford, even at the supposed top, he wasn't being celebrated for brilliance. He was being accused of theft for thinking too well. His phone vibrated. A message from Marissa. They've locked your files on the course drive, but I still have the video. Don't worry, I've got your back. Elijah stared at the screen, a pulse of gratitude pushing through his frustration. He wasn't alone, but the system didn't care about videos. It cared about preserving the hierarchy. Hours passed. He couldn't concentrate, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. By nightfall, he found himself back on the steps of the admin building, sitting in the dark, watching lights blink on in faculty offices. That's when he heard the door click open. A security guard stepped out, middle-aged, worn face, quiet voice. He paused beside Elijah and said, without looking directly at him, "You know they set this up, right?" Elijah looked up. "What do you mean?" "They've done it before. I've seen kids come through here with brilliance they couldn't box." Then boom, integrity reviews. Always starts the same way. The man's voice lowered. "They're trying to make you disappear, son. Don't let them." A security guard quietly tells him, "They're trying to make you disappear, son. Don't let them." It started with a blurry, 30-second clip. Marissa Lowe hadn't intended to upload it. Not at first. She had taken the video instinctively, more out of disbelief than documentation. But as the hours passed and Elijah's student account remained locked, as rumors swirled about cheating and plagiarism, something inside her shifted. She watched the footage again and again. Elijah's calm dissection of the problem, the clarity of his logic, the devastating precision of his chalk strokes, and realized something critical. If they buried this, they buried the truth. So she leaked it anonymously. Reddit got it first. A niche subreddit for academic math posted it under the title, "Teen Solves Ivy-Level Problem Live in Class, No One Reacts." Comments poured in within the hour. Then Twitter got hold of it. "Black genius outsmarts Oxford. Why'd the professor erase the board?"
No one clapped? Really?
Within a day, the video had over 8 million views. The algorithm did its job. It pushed the clip into timelines of educators, activists, and casual observers alike. People began demanding Elijah's name. Some guessed. Others asked outright. Eventually, someone connected the dots to Oxford University, then to Professor Halbrook, and finally to Elijah himself. For a moment, the tide felt electric. Articles were written. Think pieces emerged with headlines like, "Why is genius only recognized when it's white?" and erased in real time, "How institutions gaslight black brilliance." For 48 hours, Elijah Brooks was a symbol. The backlash arrived just as quickly, sharp and coordinated. Right-wing pundits seized on the story. One called it a performative scam, pushed by woke math departments. Others asked why no professors had spoken in his defense, if he was truly gifted. Then came the darker side of virality. Trolls dug into his social media. His address was leaked. His high school GPA posted on message boards. Conservative forums questioned if he had been admitted through a diversity quota. A YouTube channel with 500,000 followers accused him of faking the entire thing, using deep math fakes and AI script writing. Elijah read none of it. He didn't have to. His dorm door told the story. Someone had carved liar into the wood. Another day, his laptop was smashed while charging in the common room. No witnesses. No name. And still, the university said nothing.
No press statement. No support. No public acknowledgement of the video's accuracy. Halbrook declined interviews. The administration's silence stretched like a barricade, visible, immovable, and deliberate. Even Marissa, who had uploaded the video, was quietly removed from the TA schedule. No explanation. Elijah sat alone most nights, surrounded by proof no one wanted. The pages in his notebook, the memory of the chalk in his fingers, the sound of the silent room after he solved the problem. It all clung to him like ghosts. And yet in every conversation about him, the subject wasn't the math. It was him, his skin, his background, his audacity, his refusal to fail publicly. On campus, students walked past him with expressions either blank or suspicious. A few whispered traitor under their breath. Others just stared. In America, a black boy with brilliance wasn't just unusual. He was dangerous. One afternoon, Elijah sat outside the student center,
hoodie up, watching pigeons scatter across the walkway. His phone buzzed. A new email. From an unknown domain. Subject: they're lying to you about your family. Please meet. Urgent. There was no body text. Just a location on campus. A timestamp. At first he thought it was a trap. Another setup in this endless labyrinth of manipulation. But something about the wording felt personal. Not institutional. Not threatening. He showed up at the meeting spot, half expecting a prank. Instead, a woman in a tan trench coat stepped forward. She looked about 40, mixed race, with sharp eyes and a press badge tucked into her notebook. Elijah Brooks? She asked. He nodded. I'm Quinn Harlow. I'm a journalist. Independent. I've been following your story, and I think there's something you need to see. She handed him a folder, manila, old school. Inside were black and white photos, faded newspaper clippings, and a Xeroxed cover page from a dissertation titled Recursive Intelligence, The Lost Theorem of Dr. Langston Avery. Elijah froze. He had never heard that name before. That man, Quinn said, tapping one of the photos, is your grandfather. Elijah stared at the image, a black man in thick glasses, standing in front of a chalkboard that looked eerily like the one Elijah had faced just days ago. Equations sprawled behind him in the same slanted style. His expression was intense, focused, familiar. He was a mathematician? Elijah asked, voice dry. Quinn nodded. One of the best. In the 60s he proposed a theoretical model decades ahead of its time. But he was denied tenure. His work was discredited. His publications pulled. The university he worked for, guess where? Oxford, never cited him again. They erased him. Elijah's throat went dry. Why? Because he was black. And because he was right. Quinn lowered her voice. I think what's happening to you now, it's not just about this equation. It's about history repeating itself. You're not just brilliant, Elijah. You're part of a legacy they've been trying to bury. Elijah sat back, the world tilting under him. All this time he thought the math had come from nowhere. From endless nights, survival instincts, and raw persistence. But maybe it wasn't just his. Maybe it was inheritance. A seed passed down through generations, denied sunlight but never fully dead. Quinn closed the folder. I want to help tell your story. The whole truth. But it's your call. Elijah looked at the cover page again. Dr. Langston Avery. A name no one had spoken to him. A man erased by the same institution trying to erase him now. And yet, even in erasure, the brilliance had found a way to return. He stood slowly. I want to know everything. Quinn smiled, but there was sadness in it. You will. But brace yourself. The truth's heavier than the silence. A journalist arrives on campus, holding a hidden story from Elijah's past, one even he doesn't know fully. The folder sat on Elijah's lap like it held a bomb. The wind had picked up outside as he sat with Quinn Harlow on a rusted bench, tucked behind the library's shadow. It was the one place he felt he could breathe. But now, as he stared at the photo of Dr. Langston Avery, something inside him twisted into knots. The resemblance wasn't just there, it was undeniable. The slope of the nose, the sharpness of the eyes, even the way Langston held the chalk in the old black and white photo mirrored Elijah's stance at the board days ago. Quinn spoke softly, letting the weight of her words settle. He wasn't just brilliant, Elijah, he was revolutionary. He proposed a recursive matrix system in 1964 that predicted dynamic outcomes in chaotic environments. It was 15 years ahead of its time. He should have been celebrated. Elijah barely blinked. So why haven't I heard of him? Why hasn't anyone? Because they erased him, Quinn said. On purpose. She flipped to another page. A copy of an old journal rejection letter, typed in harsh font with cold academic language. After he submitted his findings to the Oxford Journal of Theoretical Mathematics, he was quietly blacklisted. 3 of his co-authors removed their name. His job at the university disappeared. The paper vanished from circulation. Elijah shook his head slowly, his voice barely a whisper. You're saying, my grandfather was a genius, and they buried him? I'm saying, Quinn replied. They stole from him. And then they disappeared him. She pulled out an article, a grainy 1971 clipping from a Detroit newspaper. Local professor's work controversial, labeled fringe by peers. The subheading was worse, mathematics or madness. Ivy League distances itself from radical claims. But he wasn't wrong, Elijah muttered, eyes scanning the paragraphs. The math. If he was doing what you're saying, That's predictive modeling before it even existed.
That's why you've always seen things the way you do, Quinn said. You're not starting from nothing, you're building from blood.
Elijah leaned back against the bench, mind spiraling. The isolation he'd felt all his life, the sense that his mind was wired differently, it suddenly made sense. The notebooks he filled alone, the algorithms he constructed without knowing why, the questions he asked in class that made teachers uncomfortable. It was never random. It was a buried inheritance. But he hadn't just inherited brilliance. He'd inherited a legacy of silence. Why didn't anyone tell me? He asked. Because Langston Avery disappeared in every way except blood, Quinn said. He changed his name after the fallout, moved to Michigan, started over, quietly. He never published again. Elijah's throat tightened. He lived his whole life erased. Quinn nodded slowly. And now it's happening to you. The words settled like a fog over them both. Elijah closed the folder. I need to know everything he wrote, not just the scraps, all of it. I thought you'd say that, Quinn replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive. This is everything I could recover, from microfilm archives, leaked university files, declassified grant records. But there's one thing missing, his final manuscript, the one he wrote after everything fell apart. It was never published, never digitized. Elijah looked up. Does it still exist? Quinn hesitated. That's the twist. I think it does. She pulled out a photo, an image of a storage unit receipt, dated 1987, signed L. Avery. The unit had been rented under a false name, then forgotten. Detroit, she said. It's still there, untouched, sealed. Elijah's heart pounded. Then I'm going back. He didn't even think twice. Within hours he was on a bus heading north. No suitcase, just a backpack, Quinn's flash drive, and a notebook filled with questions that felt like keys without locks. The road hummed beneath him, as the city of Oxford faded behind him. Ahead lay something else entirely, not just answers but reckoning. Detroit greeted him like an old song, familiar, fractured, and fierce. He found the storage unit tucked behind an abandoned strip mall on the city's east side, the paint peeling and weeds clawing through the pavement. The manager was hesitant at first, but after some persuasion and the old rental documents Quinn had dug up, he agreed to unlock it. The metal door screeched upward. Inside, dust floated like ghosts, boxes stacked neatly, labeled only with single letters. In the back corner, beneath a faded tarp, sat a locked trunk. Elijah opened it. Inside were papers, hundreds of pages, handwritten notes, graphs, diagrams, formulas that seemed to shimmer off the page. He pulled out a thick manuscript, its title page marked in bold ink, The Recursive Nature of Conscious Logic, Langston Avery's final work. Elijah sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor and began reading. Hours passed, unnoticed. The manuscript wasn't just advanced, it was decades beyond anything he'd seen. It predicted machine learning principles before computers were capable of processing them. It mapped patterns in language, cognition, chaos, bridging philosophy with raw calculus in ways that made his chest tighten. Every few pages, Langston had left notes in the margins. Don't let them make you doubt your mind. Someday they'll need this, even if they never admit it. And one, near the end, underlined twice. What they silence in me, they will fear in you. Elijah closed the manuscript with trembling fingers. This was it, not just the proof of genius, but the blueprint of a legacy designed to be silenced. He stared at the pages, his own reflection caught in a broken mirror leaning nearby. They hadn't just come for Langston, they were coming for him too. But this time they weren't going to win. A hidden manuscript from his grandfather surfaces, and the mathematical theory inside is decades ahead of anything Oxford has ever taught. The email came at midnight. Short, cold, final, subject to disciplinary measures, enforced. Body. Due to ongoing investigation into multiple academic violations, you are hereby suspended from Oxford University. Your housing access has been revoked. Your ID is no longer valid. You are prohibited from entering university grounds until further notice. That was it. No explanation. No due process. No appeal. Elijah stared at the screen in the glow of a bus station bench, his breath visible in the Mississippi cold. He hadn't returned to campus after finding his grandfather's manuscript in Detroit. Somehow, deep down, he had known this would happen. Still, it didn't dull the shock. They hadn't just accused him. They'd erased him. By morning, campus security had changed the locks on his dorm room. His belongings were bagged and placed in storage. His student emails were archived and inaccessible. His name disappeared from the university portal, as if he had never existed. Elijah's Oxford career had lasted exactly 4 months. Now he was just another boy with brilliance and no address. He returned to town and found refuge in an abandoned building near the railway line. A cold, forgotten structure once used as an old train depot. There was no heat, no light, just 4 cracked walls, a leaky roof, and the pages of Langston Avery's manuscript spread across a folding table he found in the alley. He slept on the floor with his backpack as a pillow. He borrowed an old laptop from Quinn, who stayed in touch, sending updates and articles. Her offers of help were sincere, but Elijah didn't want charity. He wanted fire, and he had it. Each night, he pored over the manuscript, like it was scripture. And slowly, the theory began to make sense. Langston hadn't just developed predictive modeling. He had discovered a framework, one that redefined how intelligence evolved in systems, even beyond human behavior. It wasn't just mathematics. It was a blueprint for artificial cognition. It could change everything. He started building simulations on the borrowed laptop. Crude, but effective. He fed in patterns from historical data, watched the algorithm adapt, not just calculate, but intuit. It was like watching thought take shape, like seeing the raw shape of intuition in code. But the more progress he made, the more the world seemed to close around him. Online, Oxford released a carefully worded statement about disciplinary investigations involving academic misconduct, without naming him, but the implication was clear. Media began to shift. Former professors distanced themselves. Podcasts speculated if he had exaggerated the racism narrative. His name trended again, but this time with hashtags like mathhoax and in Elijah exposed. People who had once called him a genius now called him dangerous. Meanwhile, universities began pushing out statements clarifying they had no formal relationship with Elijah Brooks. Tech companies that had once hinted at internships withdrew quietly. He was too smart to be invisible, too black to be undeniable. But none of it stopped him. One night, huddled in a coat under layers of thrifted blankets, Elijah sat staring at the final equation in his grandfather's work. It was incomplete. A gap, maybe intentional, maybe not. Langston had left behind dozens of scribbled possibilities, but none conclusive. Elijah closed his eyes and let the silence speak. Then it hit him, not as a lightning bolt, but as a slow rise, a recursion layered in predictive decay, a way to teach the algorithm to adapt to unknown inputs, not by forcing pattern, but by understanding absence. He picked up the laptop, typed for hours, tested, failed, tweaked, ran it again. And when it finally compiled, he didn't cheer. He just stared. He had done it. The complete theorem. Not just artificial intelligence. Artificial intuition. Elijah uploaded the formula to an open-source coding site, under an alias. No fanfare. Just 3 words in the description. For the ones erased, he logged off and curled up under his blankets. 23 hours later, an alert hit a federal cybersecurity node in Washington, D.C. The algorithm's code had triggered a red flag in the Department of Defense's predictive systems. It was capable of mapping probabilistic behavior with 91% accuracy in live variables. And the account that posted it couldn't be traced. He uploads a theorem to a coding site, and the government flags it within. The first sign was the van. It appeared before sunrise, silent and matte black, parked across from the crumbling building Elijah now called home. No logos, no plates, just presence. At first he ignored it. He'd seen plenty of suspicious vehicles before. But this one didn't leave. Not after 10 minutes. Not after 2 hours. By the time the sun crept across the broken pavement, he felt it. Something was coming. The knock wasn't loud. It was controlled. Calculated. 3 times. He opened the door cautiously. 2 men in dark jackets stood there. They didn't flash badges, but they didn't need to. The air around them said everything. Elijah Brooks? He nodded. We'd like to talk. They didn't raise their voices, didn't threaten. But there was no option to say no. They gestured toward the van. He followed, gripping his coat tighter, heart hammering like a drumline. Inside, the air was cold, the seats steel, the windows blacked out. The men sat across from him, flanked by a woman with a thin tablet in hand. You're 17, one of the men said. From Detroit. currently suspended from Oxford University. No fixed address. No known guardian on file. Elijah swallowed. I didn't break any laws. The man's eyes stayed flat. Then help us understand something. How does a 17-year-old with no formal AI training post a recursive quantum modeling code that outperforms everything we've got at Langley? Elijah blinked. What are you talking about? The woman turned her tablet to show a data visualization. An AI simulation looping across the screen. This is your algorithm, right? He leaned forward slowly. I uploaded that anonymously. Not anonymously enough. The room pulsed with silence. They didn't ask him how he built it. They asked him who helped, who funded him, who trained him. Elijah told them the truth, that it was all from a manuscript his grandfather wrote in the 1960s, that he finished what was already started, that he wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was just solving the unsolvable. But they didn't care. To them, he wasn't a student anymore. He was a breach, a risk. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten to arrest him. They simply stared with eyes that measured futures. Finally, one of them leaned forward and said, "Stay off the grid. You're not being charged. But don't upload anything else." Then they left him outside in the cold, the van disappearing like it was never there. He stood motionless, breath fogging the air, his mind spinning not with fear but with clarity. They were afraid of him, not because he had broken something, because he had built something they couldn't control. Back in his makeshift shelter, Elijah stared at the laptop. He thought of deleting everything, burning the papers, walking away. Instead, he backed it all up on an encrypted drive. Just in case. That evening, Oxford released a public statement. It was carefully worded, full of legal padding and institutional coldness. It mentioned historic academic concerns and previous instances of speculative theories, from Langston Avery, a controversial figure in mathematical history. They denied any wrongdoing in Elijah's case, and in the same breath distanced themselves from both grandson and grandfather. It was a professional obituary disguised as policy. Elijah read it in silence. And when he was done, he said nothing. Because he understood now, every system built to measure genius had limits, and he had exceeded them. The video continued to circulate online. Despite the university's attempt to bury it, anonymous accounts kept reposting. Hashtags like Legacy erased and Langston lives trended again. But briefly, the news cycle had moved on. But in a penthouse loft overlooking San Francisco Bay, someone hadn't. Maddox Lane was a name only a few people truly understood. A reclusive tech billionaire, with investments buried in every major frontier: AI, space exploration, biosynthetic consciousness. He moved in shadows and algorithms. And when the Elijah Brooks video crossed his desk, he didn't laugh, he didn't scroll. He froze. He watched the video twice, then read every article, then called 3 former intelligence contacts, then leaned back, phone in hand, and said 2 words: "Find him." But a rogue tech billionaire sees the video and says, "Find him. Now." The call came after midnight. No caller ID, no ringtone, just a vibration and a pause, as if the phone itself was holding its breath. Elijah Brooks? The voice was smooth, practiced, toneless, the kind of voice trained not to leave fingerprints. "I represent Mr. Maddox Lane. He would like to meet you. Privately. Travel arrangements will be made. You'll be safe." Elijah said nothing at first. He was standing under a streetlight outside the old train station, the only place nearby with working public Wi-Fi. The wind was biting for late October, and the glow of the screen painted his fingers in ghost light. "Where?" he finally asked. "Nevada. Coordinates will follow." Click. No follow-up. No number to call back. Just silence. 2 days later, a car with windows too dark to be legal picked him up from a forgotten side road near the outskirts of town. The driver said nothing. The car didn't play music. Elijah sat in the back with a backpack containing Langston's manuscript, a borrowed laptop, and a hard drive with the final version of the theorem. No internet, no connection, just faith in what he had built and what he was walking into. They drove him straight to a private runway. The jet waiting there gleamed like a scalpel, painted bone white against the blazing Nevada sun. A single pilot waited on the tarmac, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, nodding once before ushering Elijah aboard. The interior of the jet was quieter than a whisper. Leather seats that looked untouched, screens embedded into the walls, climate control that felt like nothing at all. No other passengers, No visible crew, just Elijah, hurtling through the clouds towards something vast and invisible. He didn't sleep. When the jet touched down, the desert welcomed him with a silent, stretching horizon, red sand, razor wind, no signs of life. But as the plane taxied off the makeshift runway, something massive rose into view beyond a bluff, a structure carved into the land itself, made of steel, solar panels, and secrecy. No gates, no guards, just control. The doors opened like a vault. He was met by a woman in a gray suit, her tablet glowing against the twilight.
Mr. Brooks, this way.
He said nothing, just followed. The compound's hallways felt like the inside of a machine. Smooth floors, seamless glass doors, biometric scanners, no art, no clutter, no sound, only utility. They passed rooms where robotic arms moved in silence, labs where code scrolled faster than human eyes could follow, and walls lined with temperature-controlled servers. This was not a place built for people. It was built for minds, the kind that usually came with string. Finally, they reached a central chamber, a circular room with floor-to-ceiling screens, and a digital table projecting a constantly shifting algorithm. At the far end stood Maddox Lane. He looked exactly as Elijah expected. Tall, silver-haired, surgical, in demeanor. His suit was matte black, his shoes soundless. But it wasn't his wealth that was most obvious. It was his comfort with power. "Elijah," he said, as though greeting a peer, not a teenager. "Welcome." Elijah didn't move. "Why am I here?" Lane gestured to the digital display. "Because you built something that makes every tech company in the valley look like children with crayons." Elijah glanced at the code spiraling across the table. His code, his and Langston's, already reverse-engineered, simulated and dissected. "You had no right to copy that." "I had every right to find you," Lane replied, unbothered. "And I want to offer you something no one else can. Protection, funding, total freedom to keep building, without the noise of the world." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "And what do you get?" Lane didn't blink. "Ownership, patent rights, control of the applications. You build it here, I license it." A pause. Heavy. Tense. "I'll make you untouchable," Lane added. "But the work stays with me." Elijah stepped back slightly. "So I become a ghost again. This time, for you." "No," Lane said coolly. "You become legend. But safely, silently." Elijah thought of Langston, of the margin notes in his handwritten manuscript. The warnings, the rage beneath the brilliance. Never let white institutions patent your mind. His jaw clenched. "You think I built this just to sell it?" Lane's voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. I think if you don't, someone else will. And they won't ask you first." For a moment, Elijah felt the weight of the offer. He could have security, a lab, assistance, silence, a future without the daily fear of being erased. But that silence would be another kind of death. "No deal," he said. Lane's eyes narrowed. "Think carefully, Elijah. You're not protected out there. I'm not protected in here either." Elijah turned and walked out. No one stopped him. They gave him a room, a sterile cube overlooking the canyon, for his comfort, they said. He closed the door, powered up the laptop and opened the terminal. That night, as desert winds howled against the reinforced glass, Elijah uploaded the completed theorem, not to Lane's secure server, but to a public blockchain, encrypted, open source, immutable. The upload window blinked once. In the description field, he typed 7 words. "This belongs to black minds everywhere." Then he hit submit. The data packet shot through the grid, spread across servers worldwide, became permanent. In the canyon below, lights blinked and stayed on. Elijah sat back alone, as the system buzzed with a power that couldn't be bought, sold, or branded. What Langston had begun would no longer live in shadows. It would live forever in code, in chaos, in truth. Elijah uploads the formula, not to Lane's server, but to a public blockchain, with one message: this belongs to black minds everywhere. It began as a ripple. A strange new equation appeared on a blockchain server, used primarily by open-source developers. No login, no name, just a file titled recursive logic, adaptive theorem number 117. The description read, "This belongs to black minds everywhere." At first, a few niche programmers clicked out of curiosity. Then came the theorists, then the universities, and then the storm. Within 72 hours, the algorithm was being downloaded, translated, simulated, and dissected by minds across the globe. Mathematicians from Sweden to Ghana were running calculations. Developers in Japan used it to optimize machine learning models in languages even neural nets had struggled with. A physicist in India called it the first intuitive artificial logic system he had ever seen. Professors in California held emergency seminars, and slowly, painfully, the truth began to surface. This wasn't just math. This was a blueprint, a living equation, capable of learning from the unknown. Not simply predicting outcomes, but adapting to chaos with a precision that defied current AI limits. And then someone traced the code back to Elijah Brooks. Within hours, his name was trending worldwide. Elijah Brooks, genius. Langston's legacy, unbought mind. The boy who had been erased, mocked, accused of fraud, was now being called the future of STEM. Black students began posting his quotes. Teenagers from Alabama to Oakland uploaded TikToks imitating his chalkboard moment. "I believe I can solve it" became a rallying cry, a meme, a mantra. Protest signs emerged on college campuses. "Let Elijah teach." In Ghana, a school mural appeared overnight. "Elijah Brooks, our future in code." Oxford was silent. The university's official Twitter account went dark. No press statement, no retraction, no apology. Just a growing void, where power had once spoken with arrogance. But while the world celebrated Elijah, the cost of his truth hit hard. He woke to a cease and desist letter from a London law firm, citing unauthorized publication of proprietary institutional research, falsely claiming the theorem originated at Oxford and was leaked unlawfully. Another letter followed, this time from a private tech conglomerate, accusing him of damaging commercial value by releasing unverified algorithms without safety protocols. He had no legal team, no money,
No place to live.
his shelter in Nevada had gone cold. After uploading the theorem, he left Lane's compound on foot and didn't look back. The moment it went live, Elijah knew the world would change, but he hadn't realized how violently systems protect themselves when they lose control. He stayed quiet, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Even brilliance has limits when it comes in black skin. He slept in cheap motels, ate from gas stations, lived offline. But the messages found him. One from a teenage girl in Chicago. "I failed math until I saw your video. Now I stay after class to learn. I'm not afraid of being smart anymore." One from a graduate student in South Africa. "My professor used your theorem to explain chaos theory today. You're on our syllabus." And another, from an elderly woman in Detroit, who once worked as a janitor in Langston Avery's building. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said the future would come back for him." Each message felt like a brick against the pressure trying to cave in his chest. But the lawsuits kept coming. News cycles flipped. Former allies became skeptical again. Analysts questioned whether Elijah had unleashed something too dangerous without understanding it fully. Oxford began leaking documents, outdated disciplinary reports, administrative memos, designed to recast Elijah not as a pioneer but as unstable. The same system that erased Langston now tried to discredit his blood. And still, Elijah remained quiet. Until one night, in a library in Albuquerque, he logged into a public computer and saw something that made him sit completely still. A physics professor at MIT had just uploaded a research paper using his theorem and called it a foundational step forward in recursive cognitive modeling. But at the bottom of the paper, in tiny print, was the note, "Inspired by theories attributed to Elijah Brooks, though primary author is unverified." They were already trying to write him out. Again, his mind raced, not with panic, but with something sharper, resolve. He remembered something Quinn had said in Detroit, back when she handed him the folder about Langston. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what they can't erase, no matter how hard they try." That night, Elijah created a new profile under his real name. He uploaded a 30-minute video, unfiltered, raw, explaining the theorem step by step, and speaking into the camera with a calm fury. "I didn't build this to be bought. I didn't build it to be buried. I built it because my grandfather never got the chance to finish what he started. Because being black and brilliant in America still means being a target instead of a treasure. And I'm done staying quiet." The video went viral in under 6 hours. The silence was broken. Lawyers backed off. Newspapers reversed course. Professors apologized publicly. An open letter with 2,000 signatures from mathematicians worldwide demanded that Oxford issue a full apology and reinstate Elijah Brooks not just as a student, but as a guest lecturer. Still, Elijah didn't return, because while the world was now watching, it still didn't understand. This wasn't about vindication. This was about liberation. Black students across the country began organizing Brooks forums, informal gatherings to decode the theorem, host peer-led math nights, and build off Elijah's work. They weren't waiting for approval. They were reclaiming space, and for once the system couldn't stop it. But just as Elijah began to feel the tide shifting, a knock came at the door of the budget motel where he was staying. It was a courier, plain envelope. Inside, a letter stamped with Oxford's seal. You are hereby summoned to appear before the Academic Disciplinary Board for a closed-door hearing concerning the unauthorized release of institutional property and violation of prior suspension terms. They were calling him back, not to honor him, but to finish what they started. A summons arrives. Oxford demands Elijah return for a closed-door disciplinary hearing. The wind at Oxford carried a different weight this time. Elijah stepped through the wrought iron gates, not in silence but in the echo of flashbulbs, muffled chants, and quiet awe. A crowd had gathered. Students, faculty, journalists, protesters, signs lifted skyward, like a forest of reckoning. Legacy over lies. You can't expel genius. Langston lives. The noise was both defiant and reverent, but the air on campus was colder, less welcoming, as if the walls themselves resented his return. He wore no suit, no tie, just a black sweater, dark jeans, and the weight of generations on his shoulders. A single messenger bag rested at his side. Inside it, one page, no laptop, no entourage, just ink, paper, and a choice. The walk across campus was surreal. Each familiar stone path reminded him of days spent invisible. Of the first time he saw that bonus question on the board. Of Brandon's laughter. Of Professor Halbrook's smirk. Of the way whiteness in power doesn't have to shout to be heard. It just has to ignore you. Now those same halls buzzed with tension. Some faculty offered stiff nods. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few students whispered his name like a secret spell. But no one stopped him. He passed the mathematics hall, where it all began. The windows looked darker now. Then the library steps where he'd once waited outside after being locked out of study groups. Then the bronze university plaque, polished to perfection, still bearing no mention of Dr. Langston Avery. He paused for a moment there, placing his hand gently against the cold metal. I'm back, he whispered. But not for me. The hearing was held in a conference chamber, carved out of tradition and self-righteousness. A long mahogany table split the room. 5 faculty members sat at its head, men and women cloaked in academic neutrality, but their eyes betrayed history. Professor Halbrook was among them, his once arrogant smirk now replaced by a tight jaw and downturned gaze. They began with pleasantries, with formality, with phrases that dripped civility like syrup over rot. Mr. Brooks, this is not a trial, the chairman said. It is a formal review. Elijah sat calmly across from them, hands folded. Yet I was sentenced without one, he replied. That silenced the room. The chairman cleared his throat and continued. In light of recent developments, including the unauthorized public release of sensitive material, we are prepared to offer conditional reinstatement. You may resume your education under strict terms, a non-disclosure agreement, university oversight over all published material, and no reference to unresolved historical allegations. In other words, you may return, but only as their ghost. Elijah didn't move. Instead, he reached into his bag and removed a single sheet of paper. He placed it on the table. Not the theorem, not the equations the world had already seen. This was something new, something impossible. A proof. One line. Recursive. Intuitive. Raw. It bent the boundaries of logic. Elegant, yet chaotic. So advanced it seemed to shift the longer you stared at it. It was, in essence, unreplicable. Professor Halbrook squinted. His colleague beside him adjusted their glasses. Whispers emerged. One of the female professors leaned in, visibly stunned. Elijah broke the silence. This is something no algorithm on Earth can replicate. It's not in your curriculum. It's not in your archives. It lives only here, he said, tapping the side of his head, and in the bloodline you tried to erase. The gasps were real this time. One professor dropped their pen. Another turned to the others with disbelief. This wasn't just a statement. It was an exorcism. You want me to sign silence? Elijah continued, voice steady. You want me to return as if what you did didn't happen. As if Langston Avery never existed. As if erasure can be corrected with paperwork. But I'm not here to make peace. The chairman stiffened. You're choosing to reject our offer? I'm choosing to demand truth. Elijah replied. You will reinstate me unconditionally. You will restore Langston Avery's name to your records. And you will release a public statement acknowledging the theft of his research and the mishandling of mine. One of the professors leaned forward, eyes wide. Do you even understand what you're asking? I'm not asking, Elijah said firmly. I'm reminding you. The world is watching. The proof speaks for itself. But I'm done translating brilliance into apology. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was holy. Because in that moment, Elijah wasn't just a student demanding justice. He was every forgotten genius who'd been silenced for being too loud, too smart, too black. He wasn't just Langston's grandson. He was his resurrection. The chairman shifted uncomfortably. The document on the table glowed under the soft lighting. Halbrook finally spoke, barely above a whisper. This isn't in any published journal. It will be, Elijah said, but not under your name. No one knew what to say. The weight of history had filled the room and shattered the script. And then, the faculty whispers turned to gasps as he lays down a final proof, one that no algorithm on Earth can replicate. The page lay on the polished wood like it didn't belong there, like the walls surrounding it were never built to witness this moment. Elijah didn't touch it. He simply let it speak. Because this wasn't just a mathematical proof. It wasn't just the unraveling of one of the last Millennium Prize problems, a puzzle that had eluded the greatest minds for decades. It was a mirror held up to a world that had never believed his reflection belonged in its image of genius. The room fell silent as the professors read it. Some in awe, some in quiet horror. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also indicting, because for them, this wasn't just a revelation. It was a reckoning. The proof, as Elijah had constructed it, was impossibly elegant, a recursive solution to the Navier-Stokes equation. One that allowed for fluid dynamics at infinite scales, adaptable to both chaos and quantum computation. Mathematicians had spent entire careers trying to understand why it couldn't be solved. Elijah, building from the missing fragments of Langston Avery's unpublished work, hadn't just solved it. He'd redefined how it could be asked. The news spread like wildfire. Within 48 hours, the proof had been peer-reviewed and validated by independent experts across the globe. Journals rushed to publish it. Scientific communities held emergency webinars. Mathematicians and physicists called it a once-in-a-century achievement. But to Elijah, it was something else entirely. It was a conversation with a man he'd never met. In his small room, tucked away in a borrowed flat outside Oxford, Elijah sat alone, watching the headlines swirl. Black teen solves millennium problem from grandfather's ghost equations. Langston Avery's lost genius lives on through Elijah Brooks. Oxford faces global outcry over suppression of black academic legacy. The university issued a brief, careful statement. They congratulated Elijah on his contribution to the academic community, without once acknowledging the decades of suppression, racism, and silent theft that had paved the foundation of his work. But it didn't matter anymore, because Elijah had written a second page. A speech. Not for cameras. Not for applause. Just for the record. When Oxford finally, grudgingly, allowed him to speak publicly, they chose a smaller auditorium, thinking the moment would stay contained. They were wrong. Journalists filled the aisles. Students climbed the walls to watch. Professors stood in back rows, some in solidarity, others in self-preservation. The moment was electric, but Elijah stepped to the podium without flinching. He didn't read from the page. He didn't need to. I didn't build this proof to win, he said. I built it because my grandfather died before the world let him finish his sentence. The room held its breath. I was taught, we were taught, that brilliance must come with permission. That intelligence, when it shows up in black skin, must be soft, must be humble, must be silent, until spoken to. He paused. No one moved. But this proof didn't come from permission. It came from refusal, from resistance, from the margins of a textbook Langston Avery never got to publish, from classrooms where my questions were treated like disruptions, from shelters, from stolen time, from stolen name. Elijah looked out across the sea of stunned faces. To every black child taught their gifts are too loud, this is yours. To every teacher who told a student to shrink so the room would feel bigger, This is yours too. And to Oxford, I give you nothing more. He stepped back.
No applause.
Just silence. Then a single clap. Then two. Then the entire room erupted. Not just in celebration, but in release. As if history itself was exhaling. But Elijah was already walking off stage. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted the silence to end. That night, he visited the plaque on campus again. Still no mention of Langston. Still no correction. He took out a Sharpie and wrote on the stone, Dr. Langston Avery. Erased but never forgotten. Restored by proof. And then he walked away. The following morning, a letter arrived by courier. Stamped in gold. Sent from the University of Ghana. Elijah opened it slowly, the paper thick, heavy with dignity. It didn't offer admission. It offered a faculty chair, a full professorship. At 17 years old, a university in Ghana reaches out, not to offer admission, but a faculty chair. Elijah is 17. The jet touched down in Accra, under a sky streaked with gold. Elijah stepped onto the tarmac not to cold silence or side-eyed suspicion, but to warmth. Loud, open, unfiltered warmth. Cheers greeted him. Not from cameras or political opportunists, but from students, eager, brilliant, black students, who saw in him something that the West had tried to smother, reflection. There were signs, but not protest signs. They read, "Welcome home, Professor Brooks," and "Langston lives." Some carried printouts of his proof. Others held notebooks with questions they'd hoped their whole lives someone would finally understand. Professors from the University of Ghana stood in a row, hands clasped in respect, not superiority. Elders from nearby communities offered gifts, carved wood, embroidered kente, handwritten letters. Elijah wasn't just a guest, he was a returning son. The offer was unprecedented. Full professorship at 17, total intellectual freedom, founding rights to a new research facility under his vision, and not a single demand for silence. The Avery Institute. His grandfather's name, no longer a whispered myth, but etched in bold letters across architectural renderings pinned to bulletin boards across campus. Not a wing, not a plaque, a living institute, rooted in African soil, pulsing with purpose. Construction had already begun. And Elijah, who once slept on the floor of abandoned buildings with chalk dust still clinging to his cuffs, was now building a university within a university. When he walked into his first lecture, a packed hall of 200 students rose to their feet. They didn't cheer. They stood in reverence. Not because he was famous, but because they understood what it meant to learn from someone who had survived what they were told was impossible. He began the lecture without notes. Mathematics is memory, he said. Proof is protest. He taught code through call and response, embedded data science into proverbs. He spoke about Langston, not as an academic figure, but as a man stripped of his voice. He used examples from farming, migration, resistance. This wasn't theory. This was reclamation. Word spread quickly. Students from Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Senegal applied for transfers. Young girls from Accra, who had once been told not to raise their hands too high in class, now stayed after lectures asking how to use math to map water routes for their villages. Boys from the north wrote code while humming liberation songs their grandfathers once marched to. Elijah wasn't just building knowledge. He was building legacy. He refused every corporate invitation. Tech CEOs from Silicon Valley tried to fly in under the radar. Elijah didn't meet them. When a major American university offered to buy partial rights to Avery Chain, his decentralized education-focused blockchain project, he published their offer online with one note. No. He open-sourced everything. Lesson plans, code bases, AI models based on African language processing. No more gatekeeping, he said. Every week, new collaborations emerged. A university in Nairobi joined the institute to pilot climate-adaptive farming models based on his algorithm. A Ghanaian fintech startup developed financial literacy tools powered by his recursive math structure. Even local elders attended community workshops at night, decoding centuries-old folklore through systems thinking. For the first time, the West wasn't the center of gravity and innovation. Africa was. And Elijah didn't just fit into it, he accelerated it. Months passed. Quietly. Productively. Without headlines. Without Oxford. Then came the press conference, held in the courtyard of the newly completed Avery Institute. It was a celebration not of a man but of momentum. Lush gardens surrounded the stage. Banners hung in the background, not with sponsors but student art. The media had come expecting another viral moment. Elijah gave them something slower, more intentional. He stood at the podium and spoke about epistemology, how every culture carries its own mathematics, its own algorithms of survival. He didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of revision, of telling the truth in a way that didn't require the old gatekeepers to approve it. Toward the end, a hand rose from the press row. A British journalist. Young, nervous. Elijah, she asked carefully, after all of this, after Oxford, the Avery Institute, everything, would you ever return to Oxford? The question cut through the courtyard. Everyone turned. Elijah smiled. He looked past the cameras, past the journalists, past even the students, and gazed toward the red horizon stretching across Ghana's evening sky. Then he turned back to the podium and said nothing. At a press conference, a journalist asks, "Would you ever return to Oxford?" Elijah smiles but doesn't answer. Oxford didn't collapse in fire or fury. It collapsed in silence. The first signs were almost imperceptible. A respected philosophy professor quietly submitted their resignation. A few top-performing students withdrew their applications. Department chairs stopped showing up to weekly board meetings. But it didn't stop there. Resignations followed in clusters. Anonymous blog posts from graduate students described systemic racism, gaslighting, and the crushing weight of institutional hypocrisy. Then faculty members started going public. One by one, they posted on their personal websites and social account statements like, "I can no longer serve a system that punishes truth to protect tradition." Elijah Brooks was never mentioned by name in these statements. He didn't need to be. The silence surrounding him was now the loudest sound on campus. And still, Oxford refused to confront it directly. Instead, the university scrambled to control the narrative. Committees were formed, press releases issued. They launched an Equity and Excellence campaign, and a digital portal called Voices of Inclusion. A hollow apology for past misunderstandings was buried on page 4 of the university's newsletter. But no matter how polished the language, the damage was done. The mask had cracked. The world had seen behind it. The collapse extended beyond Oxford. As other prestigious institutions watched the fallout, panic spread. These were the same universities that had once rejected or ignored applicants like Elijah. Now, they were quietly reaching out to the very scholars they once marginalized. Black mathematicians, theorists, and engineers, offering visiting professorships, named chairs, and absurdly late apologies. STEM departments across the globe were forced into uncomfortable reckonings. Who had they excluded? Who had they overlooked? Who had they stolen from? Elijah watched all of it from the quiet warmth of Ghana. He didn't say a word. He had no interest in apologies that came only after exposure. While institutions fumbled to update their mission statements, he was already 10 steps ahead, building futures without waiting for permission. Meanwhile, Oxford's math department, once considered the crown jewel of European logic, began unraveling. The halls grew quieter, applications dropped, alumni donations shrank, panels were cancelled, prestigious partnerships were pulled, all because a black boy in the back of the class had dared to raise his hand. Then came the exposure. Brandon Kellerman, the preppy, privileged student who had mocked Elijah in front of the entire class, was caught in a scandal of his own. Screenshots of Venmo payments, private emails, and tutoring contracts revealed that Brandon had been paying someone to ghostwrite his assignments for over a year. Even his final thesis was flagged by plagiarism software. The university, already under fire, moved swiftly. Brandon was expelled. No fanfare. No public statement. No defense. He vanished from the halls he once walked with arrogance. And Elijah? He never once mentioned Brandon. Not in public, not in private, because some names fade under the weight of their own mediocrity. Back in Ghana, the Avery Institute was blooming. The reclamation labs, Elijah's mobile classrooms, were reaching villages and towns across the continent. They brought math, coding, science, and culture into the hands of those who had never been offered a seat at the table. The labs weren't just teaching formulas, they were teaching liberation. Girls were building solar tech to power schools. Farmers were learning to use AI models to predict seasonal yield. Elders were invited to co-teach, anchoring logic and ancestral wisdom. Elijah had built more than an institute. He had built a movement. Still, the world wanted his story. Documentary filmmakers from around the world approached him. Most were turned away. But one, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman from Senegal, sat with him on a bench beneath the baobab tree and asked no questions. She just listened. A year later, her film premiered to global acclaim. It was called The Boy Who Solved More Than Math. It traced Elijah's journey from Detroit to Oxford, to exile and return. It featured Langston's story, told through archival footage and animation. It ended with a single image, Elijah in front of a chalkboard in Ghana, surrounded by children smiling. The documentary exploded. It was streamed in schools, universities, community centers. Kids began writing Elijah's name in their notebooks. Posters went up in classrooms. Teachers rewrote lesson plans. The film ended with a quiet whisper from Elijah. Some revolutions begin not with marches, but with answers. One evening, as Elijah sat alone in his room at the institute, the lights low, and the sound of distant drums echoing in the wind, a courier arrived. No one knew who sent him. The envelope was plain, no return address, just his name, handwritten in careful script. Elijah. He turned it over, still sealed, still silent, still waiting. Documentary airs, The Boy Who Solved More Than Math. But one final letter arrives, unopened. The envelope had always been there. Elijah just hadn't seen it. Or maybe he wasn't ready to. It wasn't until a warm afternoon, deep inside the Avery Institute's archive room, that he found it hidden inside the back flap of the leather-bound manuscript his grandfather had penned decades ago. The one that had been passed, preserved, smuggled, and nearly forgotten through the years. He ran his hand over the yellowed envelope. It was aged, delicate, sealed with wax. On the front, in elegant ink, a single name had been written, to the one who finds what they could not steal. Inside was a letter, folded into perfect thirds, written in the same steady mathematical hand Langston Avery had used for his proofs. But this was not a formula. This was something heavier. Elijah took a breath. He opened it. The letter was dated 1967, the year Langston disappeared from academic record. It began plainly, but each sentence swelled with emotion, an old soul speaking across time to a future he hoped might still exist. If you are reading this, then they did not destroy everything. Elijah sat in the archive's quiet stillness, surrounded by walls lined with chalkboard fragments and annotated notebooks, and read on. Langston's words were not bitter, though they had every right to be. He described the theft, how his theorems were presented by others, how journals ignored his submissions, how rooms emptied when he spoke. But more than that, he wrote of the toll, of what it meant to carry brilliance in black skin, in a world that refused to believe both could exist in the same body. He warned of loneliness, of the cost of visibility, of the temptation to water oneself down to survive. They will celebrate your answers only if they can claim your questions. But then, the letter shifted. It became lighter, not in tone, in hope. Langston wrote of the children he once taught in secret, of the joy in their eyes when they solved problems. No one expected them to understand. He wrote of a boy he once met on a train, who solved a riddle in his head before Langston even finished saying it aloud. He wrote of belief in those yet to come. You are not alone, the letter read. You are not the beginning, and you will not be the end. They can erase records. They cannot erase rhythm. Elijah read it again, and again, until the words felt like his own heartbeat. He knew what he had to do. The dedication ceremony for the Avery Institute was held on a warm evening under a golden Ghanaian sky. Elders sat in front rows beside engineers, students, and visiting dignitaries. The institute stood tall now, not just as a building but as an idea that knowledge didn't need to be extracted to be respected, that the future of innovation could be rooted in dignity, in culture, in truth. Elijah took the stage in a simple linen shirt. He didn't wear medals or titles, just the letter folded neatly in his breast pocket. The crowd quieted. He began not with an introduction but with a breath. Then he opened the letter, and he read it aloud. Every word, every warning, every wound, but also, every hope. By the time he reached the end, the air was heavy, not with sorrow, with reverence. Some cried silently. Others held their heads high. The letter had not just crossed time. It had closed a wound. When he finished, Elijah looked up. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "We were never meant to read this, which is why we had to." He stepped down. The applause didn't come immediately. It didn't need to. The silence was its own tribute, a sacred pause. Later, he stood at the top floor of the institute, looking out over the campus. Students walked below, laughing, holding tablets, speaking languages interlaced with formulas and futures. The sun dipped low over the hill.